Okay, I'll get straight into this. When I was introducing myself, I didn't mention that I'm a member of the Planning SPC in Galway City Council, so that's another interest I have in planning. I've had a particular interest in sustainable development for about the past 15 years or so, so this is a topic I'm quite interested in. So there's a lot of ground to cover in this, so I'll get on with it and I'll be as quick as I can. So this is an outline of the presentation I'm going to give this evening. I'm going to start with what is planning, the hierarchy of plans. I'll give an overview of Project Ireland 2040 and the regional, spatial and economic strategies, the draft Galway City Development Plan, the various reports that are comprised in the draft plan, the other reports prepared to inform the preparation of the draft plan. I will offer some personal opinions and I will cover briefly how to make a submission at the end. So what is planning? In this context, we're talking about land use planning. And I've two definitions here, one taken from the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and the other from the Office of the Planning Regulator. First is that at a policy level, planning means ensuring that the right development takes place in the right locations and at the right time. Our planning system provides the social, economic and physical infrastructure necessary to meet the needs of our people and in a way that protects the many qualities of our natural and built environment. Planning plays an important role in our society. It enables us to make the best use of our resources and allows necessary and worthwhile development to go ahead. It also ensures that the environment and heritage of our towns, cities and countryside is protected. So I think there are two good definitions of planning. There's then a hierarchy of plans. And there are two types of plans. There are statutory plans and non-statutory plans. So the statutory plans, at the top of the hierarchy, you have the Project Ireland 2040, which includes the National Planning Framework from 2018 to 2040. At the second level, then, you have the Regional, Spatial and Economic Strategies, and they're 12-year plans. At the third level, then, City and County Development Plans, 6-year plans, and that's the level we're talking about this evening. At the fourth level, then, there are local area plans. They are 6-year plans. They can be extended for a period. The lower level plans must be consistent with the higher level plans. That's an absolute priority. Then the non-statutory plans, they have no legal basis, but they include framework plans, or in the county development plan, they're referred to as urban framework plans. You also have master plans, area plans, and spatial frameworks, which is a new term in the draft Galway City Development Plan. Project Ireland 2040 is the National Planning Framework, and it includes 10 strategic outcomes. It has ambitious growth targets for 4 regional cities, including Galway. The population of Galway City and suburbs is targeted to grow by between 40,000 and 45,000 by 2040. That would bring us up to 125,000 at max. The National Development Plan then is the allocation of the investment, the money to achieve, to fund the National Planning Framework. We then have 3 regional assemblies who each produce regional, economic and spatial strategies for their regions. And those must be consistent with the National Planning Framework. So our regional assembly is the Northern and Western Regional Assembly, and it covers 9 counties, including Galway. And it attempts to set out a settlement hierarchy for the region. In other words, where people within the region will live, Galway City and the principal key towns throughout the region, trying to distribute how that population growth is going to be settled. Now, the draft Galway City Development Plan itself comprises a written statement of 351 pages, an overall city map, which shows land use, zoning and objectives, a city central map, which shows also land use, zoning and objectives at a bigger scale, a draft strategic environmental assessment, which runs to 158 pages, a draft Natura impact report, which runs to 86 pages, a draft strategic flood risk assessment, which runs to 56 pages. In addition to those, there are plans, 2 other documents that informed the preparation of the development plan, the draft plan, and they are the Galway City Housing Strategy and Housing Need and Demand Assessment, which is 83 pages long, and the Galway Urban Density and Building Height Study, another 171 pages. So in total, we have 905 pages in all, plus 2 maps. So it's quite an amount of documentation to be considered. If we look at the written statement itself, the first of those documents, it has, I think, 11 chapters in total. The first 9 of them I've listed out there. So you see the most important one in some ways is the core strategy, which shows how the city development plan is going to fit into the regional strategy and the national planning framework. So that's its purpose. Then we have ones devoted to climate, housing, sustainable mobility, etc. And as I said, there are 11 in total, the last one being land use, zoning objectives and development standards and guidelines. And then we have various appendices in it as well. So if we start with looking at the residential zone land, for instance, that's section 152 in the draft plan, which looked at a settlement capacity audit. So basically what the City Council did was they looked at all the land that had been zoned for housing in the last plan, and it added in a small, well, they described it as a small additional amount of 22 hectares to bring it to a total of 143 hectares. And they basically looked at, that's all within the existing built up footprint of the city. And they basically looked at how much housing that land could support. Now, that 143 hectares doesn't include the Ardon local area plan, which adds another 164 hectares. So it just puts Ardon in context to the rest of the city, the available zone land in the city. You can see Ardon is quite large compared to that. And then the zoning is shown on those 2 maps that I mentioned previously. Climate action then in the plan. It mentions the climate resilient Galway City plan, which is the adaptation plan that was developed a couple of years ago. It then mentions a decarbonisation zone in Westside, which must at minimum reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 7% per annum from 2021 to 2030, a 51% reduction over the decade. Now that mimics the climate action plan for the country, which is the same kind of targets. So it goes on to say then the council will prepare an energy master plan for Galway City, which will include greenhouse gas baseline emissions inventory. So that will determine where are we at now, and so that we have something to measure ourselves against over the next 6 years of the plan, and we see how we're doing against that baseline. That's due to be completed by mid-2022, according to policy 2.2 in paragraph 10. The amended climate legislation requires each local authority to prepare 5-yearly local authority climate action plans. And in this draft plan, it says, it is anticipated that the City Council will commence preparation of a local climate action plan before the end of 2022. There's no completion date given. And they're only anticipating starting it before the end of the year. And really, we don't have time. You know, the clock is ticking down all the time to 2030. And time is moving on. In terms of natural heritage, recreation and amenity, it refers to the National Biodiversity Action Plan, which is out of date since last year. It included a primary commitment to move to a no-let loss of biodiversity. The National Biodiversity Forum reviewed the National Biodiversity Action Plan in February of 2021. And it made a number of recommendations, and its first recommendation was that Ireland's Biodiversity Action Plan must become a biodiversity impact plan. Now, I can't see any sign of that national plan being reviewed. It may be in course of review, but I can't find it. But there's certainly a need for a new national plan. The Galway City Biodiversity Action Plan 2014 to 24 is referenced in the City Development Plan. Again, there's no mention of a review. 2014 is quite a long time ago now. It really does need to be reviewed. Maybe they're waiting for the national plan to be reviewed first. About the City Development Plan, I think there's much positive language in the draft plan, but the real question is over implementation. It's, you know, paper never refused ink, as they say. It's easy to make positive statements in a plan, but getting them implemented is the problem. There's no support for a Galway National Park City initiative, which I think is disappointing. I think it was an opportunity for the Galway City to be ambitious, but it didn't make it in there. The council has appointed a biodiversity officer, I think just this month, And that does give us a potential for impact, which is what the Biodiversity Forum reckoned was needed. So I think that's a positive. Table 5.6 in the draft plan sets out a network of local biodiversity areas, which I think is a good thing to do. There are 10 policies which appear to be quite comprehensive, but the question I'd have is, are they measurable? There are 42 specific objectives in section 5.10. Some of them are short-term, some of them are medium and long-term. So there's quite a bit in there about that area. I'm just showing you a map here. There's an outer red line and an inner black line. The inner black line is the current Galway City functional area, or the city boundary, if you like. The red line then represents what's called a Metropolitan Area Spatial Plan area, which was introduced by the Regional Spatial and Economic Strategy a couple of years ago. And that's basically an area that is, it takes in the entirety of the city, but also quite a bit of the county as well. So it includes, as well as the City Council's functional area, it includes part of the County Council's functional area, including Barna, Cllr, Galway and Oranmore. In the City Development Plan, there's no chapter or part of a chapter in the draft plan dedicated to the MASP, which I would have expected, to be honest. The MASP, however, is mentioned 101 times throughout the draft plan. There are implications in particular for housing, transport, wastewater infrastructure, for the environment and biodiversity, and for the well-being of those living in Galway City and County associated with the MASP. And I would have expected, you know, maybe a special chapter or part of a chapter devoted to it in the City Development Plan, but it's not there. I just want to mention the Sustainable Development Goals, which were
adopted. Okay, James, turn off the telly now. They need to go up, okay, please.
Okay. The Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the United Nations in 2015 and came into effect in January 2016. And Ireland brought in a national implementation plan in 2018 for 2018 to 2020. It does say that the Sustainable Development Goals, which are part of this 2030 agenda, is voluntary. It's not legally binding, but every country has agreed to implement the SDGs, and every country is expected to develop a national framework setting out how they will be achieved. It says Ireland is fully committed to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and this plan represents Ireland's initial framework for doing so. It's the first of what will be a series of SDG implementation plans in the period to 2030. The Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment put out a consultation on the second SDG National Implementation Plan from the 16th of July to the 10th of September 2021. But when I checked yesterday, all I could find is that the consultation has been reviewed. So we haven't got the second implementation plan yet. Now, the SDGs are mentioned in the core strategy in section 1.3 on page 15. There's some generic text and the SDG graphic. It is the very first of the 608 policies in the draft plan is policy 1.1, which relates to the sustainable goals, the UN sustainability goals. And it says, through implementation of the core strategy and the policies and objectives of the development plan, advance the aims of the UN 2030 agenda for sustainable development and contribute to the achievement of the 17 sustainable development goals. And then on different chapters, there are specific SDG decals which appear on the title page of each chapter. And I've given an example of one there, climate change. So you see these on the opening page, cover page of each chapter in the development plan. The draft plan's purpose is not the achievement of the SDGs. Social Justice Ireland's Sustainability Progress Index 2022, which was just launched last week, ranked Ireland 10th of 14 comparable EU countries. Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands and Finland were the top 4 in that order, but we're down in 10th place. And we've been languishing down around that for the last couple of years in each of the Sustainable Progress Indices that have been published. I really think that it should be part of the draft plan's purpose to achieve the SDGs. And I think they should be given greater weight in the plans, and it would help to achieve sustainability. Now, in the written statement, it talks about local planning, And it has this to say about local planning: where appropriate, the policies of the plan will be developed in more detail at a local level through local area plans, and framework plans. A local area plan is in place for Ardon from 2018 to 2024, with proposed local area plans for Murrow and Headford Road area, and area plans for Castlegar and Menlock. Local area plans are statutory plans. The public consultation is legally required in relation to those. Area plans and framework plans are non-statutory plans, so consultation is at the discretion of the Galway City Council. And what is a framework plan? A framework plan sets out guiding principles for development to secure high standards in quality and design, and to generally create well-connected living environments. And that's from Galway City Council's own website. But there are guidelines for planning authorities for local area plans going back to 2013. And really, they are really meant for areas in which there's major development is anticipated, and for areas where major alterations to the built environment are anticipated. And if you think about Galway and you look at the area around the harbour, the inner harbour where the Bonham Quay development is going on now, Kent Station, the east side of Eyre Square where the Comers and the McHales own a lot of land up along there behind O'Connell's pub, and that area, Nuns Island itself, the Headford Road. These are all areas where there is major development anticipated and where major alterations to the built environment are anticipated, but still we're not getting local area plans for them from Galway City Council. Now, what the guidelines go on to say that some non-statutory studies or frameworks are prepared by local authorities to give guidance on specific development proposals working within the relevant development plan or local area plan parameters, as long as such documents work within defined policy and objective parameters of the relevant plan and do not set new policies or objectives outside the statutory process for defining such content. Their usage is both appropriate and complementary to the preparation of statutory local area plans. So framework plans are not meant to replace local area plans. They're meant to be complementary to them. So if we look at section 10.7 of the City Development Plan, the Headford Road regeneration sites, this area extends to approximately 30 hectares, and its redevelopment is best realised within the structure of a local area plan. That's what the City Development Plan says. I couldn't agree more. But why haven't we got one? That's been known for a long time. We still haven't got one. They have a specific objective now to prepare a local area plan for the Headford Road, but that was in the previous plan as well, and we didn't get it. The Land Development Agency is collaborating with Galway City Council in relation to the Dyke Road car park regeneration site. The planning permission has been granted for a 7-storey student accommodation block in 2021 within this area. And then a specific objective 10.27 says that in advance of the adoption of a Headford Road local area plan, any proposals to advance development of the Dyke Road regeneration site by Galway City Council and the LDA, having regard to the socio-economic benefits of the city, will be considered subject to the preparation of a master plan. So in other words, they can go ahead with it based on a non-statutory master plan if the local area plan hasn't been prepared. And I think this is a real weakness. We move on then. Section 10.25 talks about the Ardon local area plan. We have a plan for there, adopted in 2018, sorry. No work has been commenced on the 164 hectares of lands that are there as yet. There is a specific objective now to implement the local area plan for Ardon. Section 10.26, the Murrow local area plan. Develop Murrow in accordance with the local area plan is policy 10.6. And 10.27, specific objective 11, prepare a local area plan for Murrow. The preparation of a local area plan for Murrow was in the Galway City Development Plan 2005 to 2011. I'm going back 17 years and we haven't seen it. And there's no timeline now for preparation of this local area plan. So God knows when we'll see it. So this is a weakness again, that there isn't a time commitment to definitely do these local area plans. Now, again, then the written statement master plans will be required, and I put in required there in inverted commas, because that's the language that's used. If you look at those particular regeneration sites that I've listed out there, master plans will be required. Some of them already have developer master plans. In other words, the developer of the site has prepared the master plan, or he's in the process of preparing a master plan. In some cases, they haven't started preparing the master plans yet, but they will be required. And you see specific objectives 1027 there, require the preparation of master plans and spatial frameworks to inform development proposals. Now, a spatial framework, I don't actually know what that is. It's not defined in the city development plan. Written statement spatial frameworks required now. As I said before, this is a new term introduced in this draft plan, and it's required for a list of sites here. But again, I can't really say what a spatial framework is because they don't define what it is. And again, its specific objective there is to require the preparation of master plans and spatial frameworks to inform development proposals. Sandy Road regeneration site. This requires either a master plan or a spatial framework. They obviously haven't made up their minds which they want. But again, there's 8 hectares of land here. This is an important site. The site is a Land Development Agency national priority site for delivery of housing to include for affordable options with some commercial use. There was a public consultation held on the Sandy Road Design Review, which was prepared by the Land Development Agency, Galway City Council and the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland in 2019. But we haven't heard anything since then. There is no target date for completion of a master plan or spatial framework for this area in the draft plan. Now I want to talk about developer-led planning and the fact that it's required, a question mark there. What is developer-led planning? Developer-led planning involves the planning system responding to development proposals submitted by developers for individual sites. And a developer's primary objective will be to maximize the financial return from the development of a specific site. The Galway City Development Plan, the draft plan, and the current plan requires developers to prepare master plans, spatial frameworks for the specific project or projects on specified land sites identified in the Galway City Development Plan. Then the planning authority, Galway City Council, and sometimes on board Pinola, has to use the development process to try to achieve what it desires through pre-planning meetings with developers, seeking further information from developers when they submit their plans to address their concerns, granting permission subject to conditions, or refusing permission for development. So this, to me, is putting the cart before the horse. This is asking developers to do plans rather than doing a local area plan, and then the developer knows his proposal must fit in within the parameters of the local area plan. But this is going backwards. And this means that we end up with developers making proposals and then the City Council or Board Pinola trying to rein them in and get them back to a more acceptable form. I think it's a bad way to go about business. Are they good or bad? It is a piecemeal approach rather than a holistic approach to planning. There's no mandatory public participation or even public consultation involved. In a presentation entitled Planning for a Different Future in 2009, the chairman of An Bord Pleanála at that time, John O'Connor, having reflected on the lessons of the disastrous Celtic Tiger era, said that the future must be different. And one of the means he proposed to achieve a different future was that there must be properly adopted local area plans rather than frameworks or developer master plans. They're his words, not mine. Renowned urbanist Jane Jacobs had the following to say: cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when it is created by everybody. But this is where public participation is critical, and there is no mandatory public participation involved with developer-led planning. I'll move on then to strategic environmental assessment, which is one of the reports that is part of the overall Galway City Development Plan. What is it? It's a process for the formal systematic evaluation of the likely significant environmental effects of implementing a plan or program before a decision is made to adopt the plan or program. So it applies to plans and programs. So the City Development Plan, it applies to that. It aims to provide for a high level of protection of the environment and contribute to the integration of environmental considerations into the preparation and adoption of plans with a view to promoting sustainable development. And there are guidelines for that. And that's where I've taken that from, those guidelines. So if you look at the draft SEA, which is part of the package of documents, there's baseline data in Chapter 4, where it examines the relevant significant characteristics of the current state of the environment in relation to the following SEA topics. And there's various topics there that it looks at, including natural capital, biodiversity, population and human health, air and climate, water, soil and geology, landscape, cultural heritage, material assets, which are things, critical infrastructure, essential for the functioning of society. So water services, wastewater services, roads, transport, you know, it looks at all those material assets. It looks at interrelationships between this plan and other plans. It looks at what would happen if there wasn't a new city development plan. So it looks at the evolution of the environment in the absence of a plan in relation to each SEA topic. It sets out what the strategic environmental objectives are for each topic in Table 5.1. There's a consideration of a range of alternative development scenarios, and they must be realistic, reasonable, implementable within the planned time frame and resources, and they must be viable technically and institutionally viable. And it looks at the role of climate change in considering the alternatives in 6.3. So there are the three alternatives they considered. The continuation of density strategy as it is set out in the current city development plan and in the Ardon local area plan. So we carry on business as usual, the same type of density as we have now. The alternative 2 then is to increase density, and it focuses on regeneration areas like Kent Station, Inner Harbour, the lands of the Headford Road, as well as developing Ardon, and focus on increasing residential densities within areas that are highly accessible to existing planned frequent public transport services. The third alternative then is sustainable neighbourhoods. And it's really alternative 2 plus, promoting increased residential densities at appropriate locations, including additional strategic regeneration and opportunity sites that have spatial advantages such as close proximity to the city core, a location along an existing planned or high frequency bus service, good proximity and access to employment, services and amenities. There will be a focus on the need for good quality urban and building design to support successful placemaking and livability. So the preferred alternative is alternative 3, and that's identified in the draft plan. It says it's the most conducive to meeting the needs of the shifting demographics of Galway City with the current number of commuters, and I've underlined that because I'm a bit puzzled by that. You know, this is a future plan, and why it's looking at the current number of commuters, I'm not sure. But it's focused on future development with regeneration and opportunity sites. And I mentioned the regeneration sites before. Alternative 3, it says, will reduce traffic-related greenhouse gas and noise emissions by reducing private car use and reducing commuting times from development of areas near public transport services. It'll lead to compact development, which is in the best interest of biodiversity, as there'll be less disturbance and less urban sprawl. It'll help to target social inclusion and healthy living by developing and offering suitable housing options based on individual needs and life circumstances. So the strategic environmental assessment does an assessment of the likely significant effects of the city development plan. And section 7 predicts and evaluates as far as possible the environmental effects. Table 7.1 contains the results of the assessment of the 10 strategic goals and 608 policies in the draft Galway City Development Plan on the strategic environmental objectives set out in Chapter 5. So you can see there's, 60 pages almost of assessment there. So each strategic goal, each of the 608 and the 10, each of the 10 goals and 608 policies is rated with, and it's done by symbols there, a plus symbol which reflects a potential positive effect, and there's 618 of those. A negative, which reflects a potential negative effect, and there are none of those, which is very welcome, but I'm a bit surprised. There's a positive or a negative sign, which reflects that the positive and negative effects are likely, or that in the absence of further detail, the effect is unclear, and there's 385 of those. And 0 reflects a neutral or uncertain effect, and there are 31 of those. Table 7.2 then provides a summary of how climate action has been integrated and reflected to the draft Galway City Development Plan. And section 8 includes mitigation measures. 8.1 sets out the principal existing environmental measures, and there's about 150 of those in the draft plan. And it adds some extra, what they call strategic environmental assessment mitigation measures, but there are very few of those, only 9. And they include the following: the Circular Economy Programme 2021 to 2027. In relation to environmental improvement schemes that reflects good practice in urban design and includes the green infrastructure measures. In relation to SUS, the Sustainable Urban Drainage System, that supports and contributes to ecological connectivity and biodiversity. And the final one I find a little odd because it's progress by way of derelict sites registered, the development of derelict sites for housing and regeneration purposes through consultation with landowners and the application of the Derelict Sites Act as amended, or another means available. One would have thought that that was an ongoing process that the City Council is and has been engaged in for years, rather than a mitigation measure now that has to be brought in. Monitoring is an area that's covered here as well. Monitoring will focus on the aspects of the environment likely to be significantly impacted by the implementation of the new plan. The targets and indicators are derived from the strategic environmental objectives discussed in Chapter 5. SEA monitoring reporting as a mid-term review of the plan in 2026 is suggested, but then the non-technical summary in the SEA report says it'll be 2 years after adoption, which would be 2025. It recommends that the monitoring report be made available to the public. Table 9.1 SEA monitoring table lacks quantitative targets. For instance, increase in modal shift from private car to public transport and active travel. There's no baseline figure or no target modal share. So how can you measure that? How can you monitor it? And that's just one example. And the final one is what really bothers me. It mentions LECP, that's local economic and community plan stakeholders, and heritage plan stakeholders. They're mentioned once each. But non-governmental organisations such as GEN, ourselves, Galway City Community Network, Antashka, Irish Wildlife Trust, Birdwatch Ireland, Bat Conservation Ireland, and I could go on, they're not mentioned at all. The only stakeholders mentioned are government departments and agencies, and that's, I think I have a serious problem with that. Then there's a draft Natura impact report. A Natura impact report has to be done anywhere there's a potential for an impact on what are called Natura sites. The Habitats Directive provides legal protection for habitats and species of European importance. It requires maintenance or restoration of habitats and species of European community interest at favourable conservation status. The establishment and conservation of European Natura 2000 sites. We have the special areas of conservation, SACs, as you know them, and special protection areas, SPAs, under the Conservation of Wild Birds Directive. Appropriate assessment is a process of assessment of plans which are likely to have a significant effect on any European site in view of its conservation objectives. There were 71 Natura 2000 sites in total screened for potential impacts. The zone of influence is within 15 kilometres of Galway City. A total of 11 Natura 2000 sites, 4 of which are within the city boundary were considered. And of the approximately 570 policies, 175 were screened in for potential impact. Now, it says 570 policies. By my count, there are 608 policies identified in the SEA report. And these are the European sites suggested to appropriate assessment. You'll be familiar with a lot of them: Galway Bay Complex, Cllr, SAC, Cllr SPA, Inner Galway Bay SPA, etc., etc. So the conclusions from the appropriate assessment in the the Natura Impact Report are the implementation of the draft city development plan has the potential to result in impacts to the integrity of the European sites if unmitigated. Risks have been addressed by the inclusion of mitigation measures that will prioritize avoidance of impacts in the first place and mitigate impacts where these cannot be avoided. The Natura Impact Report includes recommended mitigation measures in Table 5.3 on page 46. In addition, all lower level plans and projects arising through implementation of the plan will themselves be subject to the appropriate assessment process when further details of design and location are known. So this is an ongoing process. So having incorporated the mitigation measures, it is considered the plan will not have a significant adverse effect on the integrity of European sites. There's a strategic flood risk assessment report as part of the package of documents. Its purpose is to provide a broad assessment of flood risk to inform strategic land use planning decisions. Galway City is covered by the Western Catchment Flood Risk Assessment and Management, the CFRAM program. Most of you have heard of it. It included the Cllr, some of its various tributaries and mill races, as well as the city coastal zones. And within Galway City, the main sources of flood risk have been identified as coastal and estuarine flooding of areas adjacent to the coast or tidal estuaries, fluvial or riverine flooding due to the riverbanks overtopping, fluvial or riverine flooding due to embankment collapse or overtopping, particularly along the Dyke Road embankment, pluvial flooding resulting from water runoff and ponding in low spots following intense rainfall, drainage flooding due to failure and inadequacies of the sewerage system. And we've seen plenty of evidence of that in recent years, with stormwater overflows regularly overflowing, even when rainfall wasn't that terribly heavy. So there are question marks over the sewerage system as it is. It defines flood zones, three different definitions. Zone A is high probability of flooding, probability more than 1 in 100 for a river, and more than 1 in 200 for a coast. 1 in 100 years, that is 1 in 200 years coast. Zone B, moderate flooding, moderate probability of flooding, a probability between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000 for a river, and between 1 in 200 and 1 in 1,000 for the coast. And then Zone C, low probability of flooding, less than 1 in 1,000 years. The initial screening was undertaken for a total of 18 regeneration and opportunity sites, and they're set out in table 7.2. There are 11 in Zone C, which is low probability of flooding. 7 are within Zones A, B, and sometimes C. There are maps in the report and further commentary in relation to sites in Zones A and B. Just going back to the City Development Plan, it's again, there are housing targets there, section 1.46 housing targets for the core strategy. And there are 2 years looked at, 2026 and 2031. The Galway MASP, which is part of the Regional Spatial and Economic Strategy, has targets for the MASP of 27,500 by 2026, up from what it was in 2016 when the last census was done, and another 14,500 by 2031, a total of 42,000 in the MASP. Then for Galway City and Suburbs, there is 23,000 of an increase allowed for by 2026, and 12,000 by another 12,000 by 2031, a total of 35,000. So that would be 35,000 plus, say, about 80,000 in 2016, which brings us to 115,000 by 2031. The National Planning Framework target is to get to about 120,000 or 125,000. In 2020, the Economic, Social and Research Institute had a look at these targets. And I know Jen in their submission and GCCN in their submissions on the previously on the issues paper suggested the targets above were unachievable. They seem to have come up with more modest targets, an increase of 14,000 by 2026, and plus an additional 5,755 by 2031. That will bring us to a total of 19,818 of an increase. Add that to about the 80,000 in 2016 brings you to about 100,000. So in the plan itself, it says it is acknowledged that these population forecasts are targets that may not be achieved by the benchmark years of 2026 and 2031, but regardless, provision should be made to facilitate the opportunity for such growth in zone lands within the existing local level plans in the overall MASP area as shown in figure 1.4. You know, it's almost, they've almost thrown in the towel in terms of achieving the National Planning Framework target. Which I think they're being realistic, but again, it shows the government makes plans, but the plans don't really get implemented properly. Now, there's a housing strategy and housing need demand assessment as one of the documents as part of the draft plan. Its purpose is to estimate the existing and future housing requirements for Galway City. The National Planning Framework requires local authorities to use this housing need demand assessment tool. They published guidance and the tool in April 2021. This is the first time it's been used. It produces an estimate of total future housing need by 2028, broken down into 4 tenure types. And there they are: owner-occupied, private rented, social rented, affordability constraint. So owner or buyer houses, 906, private rented, 1,047. Now here's a challenge for you: socially rented, 1,575 houses by 2028. That's really going to stretch Galway City Council. Affordability constrained, then 903 houses by 2028. The total number of houses of 4,443 by 2028. We have another new study that informed the plan. There's one or two, the Galway Urban Density and Building Height Study. Its purpose is to examine what are the optimal densities and heights that can be achieved, and that can achieve the most efficient and effective use of land, can make a positive contribution to the character of the city, and can create good quality mixed use communities while also contribute to successful placemaking and livability. Study looks at various city neighbourhoods to determine prevailing densities, prevailing heights, and it offers guidance then on densities open to consideration and heights open to consideration. But a point I want to make is density doesn't necessarily require height. A lot of commentators here say, if you want density, you have to go up. Well, in 2019, the winner of the Sterling Prize for Architecture in the UK was Goldsmith Street in Norwich. It's a council scheme of 105 homes, rows of 2-storey houses, bookended by 3-storey flats, designed to meet rigorous passive house standards. It achieves a density of 82 dwellings per hectare, which is a very high density. Just to put it in comparison, the Ardon local area plan provides for medium net densities of 30 to 35 units per hectare and high net densities of 35 to 50 units per hectare, nowhere near what was achieved in Norwich. And again, Camden Courtyards, London, named the best new place to live at the London Planning Awards in 2019. Fully residential scheme comprising 50% private and 50% affordable homes. There are 164 homes in a development which is 7 stories high at maximum. The building is in the shape of an S wrapped around 2 shelter courtyards. There's an image of it there. The density achieved is a remarkable 410 dwellings per hectare. Who needs 22 stories as planned at Can Station, Augustin Hill? I suggest we don't really need that. We just need good architecture. How to make a submission, you can read that yourselves in due course. The main important thing is the closing date is the 13th of April. That's absolutely strict. Submissions after that will not be accepted. So I've told you what is planning. I've covered the hierarchy of plans. I've given an overview of the Project Ireland 2040 and the regional spatial and economic strategies, draft Galway City Development Plan, the various reports that are comprised in the plan, and the other reports prepared to inform the preparation of the draft plan. I've offered some personal opinions. I've covered, well, I haven't really covered how to make a submission. I'm leaving that to yourselves. But do make a submission. One sentence or one page or multiple pages on one or more issues of interest to you. It is important to make a submission. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Brendan. That was absolutely fantastic. I think we could all agree with that. Really fantastic presentation, and gives us great focus on the things to look at when we're making our own submissions and the things that matter to us. We'll move on straight on to Alistair now, just because time is against us, and we'll come in then at the end for a few questions. Can you share your screen?
I can. Hold on for a moment.
Okay.
So
Alistair is going to give us.
How do I show me? Okay, yeah.
You can explain over the county development plan.
Yeah. Okay, can you see that now?
Yep, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have no hope of following the detail of Brendan's. We had a slightly large, further along in the plan, so I've covered most of the detail. I haven't covered in detail everything that was in it. We had over 1,500 pages on the plan, and we've just gone through the main process. So I'm describing basically where we're at in our plan rather than the process, which is fairly similar to the county. What I will describe is what's different, what is different, and what's occurred along the way. So we're in week, I think, 87 of about a 99-week process. We've done the first draft, and we're on to what's called the material alteration stage. So the process started with the chief executive sending out an issues paper, looking for submissions on an issues paper, basically asking for public input on what the issues facing the county were. There was then a round of meetings with the councillors on what we thought needed to be included in the draft plan, following from that. So we would raise, with 39 councillors, we raised about 2 or 3 issues each. I would have raised sea level rise and transport have been the 2 main ones. The planners went out and drew up the draft plan based on that process. And coming out of that, we had the first draft plan. That went out in public display last year, after which we got back 2,500, over 2,500 submissions in total coming into that. Based on that, we then had a chief executive's report in October, and that summarized all of the submissions. Now, a large fraction of the submissions were effectively repeats. So we had a write-in, effectively postcard campaign on behalf of the Greenways, and we had a large number of repeats. So on those, the two main Greenways, the Quiet Man Greenway and the Connemara Greenway. We also had several hundred submissions on the wind farms, which I'll come to. But all told, the chief executive's report summarizing all of these was about 700 pages, which had to be read into the minutes, and each submission that was effectively voted on. That's gone through. We're now into the second stage of that, which is from that. Only the change the draft now goes back out on plan, back on display. Only the material alterations that we have made to that draft plan can be voted on in this stage, and that comes up into the into the draft that's open at the moment until March the 4th. So the material alterations is about 100 pages, and there's a next round coming into that. Okay, so from the county perspective, this is what the county looks like. We are, from a planning perspective, dividing the county up into 7 levels of hierarchy. The top levels of the hierarchy are very much the key town. Galway City are essentially excluded. We have 2 key towns, Ballinasloe, Tuam. We have Athenry marked down as one of third layer down, which is strategic potential. Self-sustaining town, what we call self-sustaining towns of Loughrea, Gort, and then a number of small growth towns, Moycullen, Uachtarard, Portonmer, etc. And then small growth villages below that. I mean, with each of these, we then have a separate target that we aim to go for. So in the middle, we have the metropolitan area strategic plan, and that's basically the driver of the economic growth of the whole area. But it's second level down, the key towns, we recognise how important they are, and we come up with separate plans for each of those. So we have local area plans being developed explicitly for each of those, and we work down through the hierarchy with different levels of support for each of the levels. Now, a large fraction, the most contentious area is that a large fraction of the planning happens in rural areas, and that has dominated the development of the plan, which I'll come forward to next. From a landscape environmental perspective, we also have an SEA approach, but we also had divided up the landscape into several categories. The landscape sensitivity was drawn up into classes 1 to 4, from a low sensitivity, unlikely to be adversely protected, all the way up to class 4. And that impacts the potential development in terms of rural one-off houses, which is one of the most contentious issues, which I'll come to next. When we're overlapping the city, the key thing to think about is metropolitan area strategic plan. It doesn't actually include Mulligan, Brendan. It does include Barna, but it stops short of Mulligan itself. Stops short of Mulligan. It includes Barna, Cllr, Owen Moore. But the key part of this basically is it's essentially where the city, the metropolitan area and area of influence of the city, and that's driven by the city, and also its economic plan. So from the county's perspective, the mass basically is seen as one contiguous area. When we're including the division out of population into towns and villages, and where we're planning for population growth, we don't get to move population numbers between expected growth between villages if they're inside and outside the MASP. By that I mean we can when we were looking at the potential growth numbers for the towns and villages, we could increase we could disagree with the planners and place a higher level of expected growth on, say, Cllr than Mulligan in than the planners had originally anticipated, and try to plan for that by moving residential planning between one village and another. But we don't have the facility to do so within inside or outside the MASP. So, for example, the numbers of housing units that were to be built in Barna are effectively fixed from our planning perspective. Now, key to the MASP from a large and economic perspective is that to the east it's driven by the economic corridor of the M6, also the railway line, which is to be double tracked out to Arnmore and out to Athenry, which leads to the development of Ardon and Garon as key parts of the metropolitan plan. And that overlaps the development of the city and county development quite importantly. It also impacts the potential development out towards the east. So the economic plan that drives the MASP from the county perspective is the development of that economic corridor. Now, one of the most contentious issues that we've been working through in the county development plan has been the role of the Office of the Planning Regulator. So, as Brendan pointed out, the plans consist of a hierarchy, and our plans have to be consistent with national plans, which read OSES, etc. The Office of the Planning Regulator is the agency that's required to enforce that. And at the end of our development of our draft plan, the Office of the Planning Regulator made submissions, and those are the first set of submissions that we had to consider when we were working through all of the Chief Executive's report. In practice, the OPR made 17 recommendations and 12 observations. Now, by recommendation, the OPR is effectively making a directive that we must follow a particular rule. We must follow the OPR's recommendation. If we disagree with the recommendation from the OPR, it goes to the minister. We have to explain why in the first round, in the first instance, and why we would do so. If the OPR does not accept that, it goes to the minister, who makes a ruling on the situation. And this has already happened in Meath recently, for example. if the minister overrules the OPO and goes with the decision of the council, the minister is effectively committing to change national policy and national law. So it's a strong thing to happen and hasn't been happening. Observations are weaker and they're followed separately. So the key ones, for example, that the recommendations that the OPO has been working towards have been one on the core strategy in terms of how we work through the number of the population growth within the county. Things like the recommendation on the land use supply, which is on one-off housing, and traveller accommodation, for example, and recommendation with that. The recommendations of the first one was relatively technical. In the county had made its calculations on the population growth based on a methodology based on census and expected population growth numbers, whereas the recommendation for housing supply, where in practice the OPO wanted us to go with the ESRI, which you followed. As part of the core strategy, we were supposed to set within that most of the development within the county would happen within the settlement centres rather than one-off houses. And that was the chief bone of contention that we ended up working to. I think about half of our time on the about 40 hours of debate were involved in this particular issue. For reference, the county issues about 2,500 planning applications per year. I've been told approximately 1,700 of those would be one-off houses. Under the OPO's plan and the core strategy numbers, that would have been reduced to about 900 one-off houses over the course of a 6-year plan. So effectively 90% reduction of rural one-off housing. This was extremely contentious for that reason. And ultimately we ended up going, ultimately the council, I did not agree, ended up going with a number that we would disregard the number of 911, which is number that we would be limited to one-off housing, and that we would simply not count it. And we would also add in brownfield sites into that picture. This will be reviewed by the OPO in the plan that comes back to us. So along with the public submissions on the material alterations, there'll be the OPO's opinion on our decision on this, which I suspect will be negative. And that he is potentially in a situation of putting a line exactly through that. Now, the key challenge with this is that our duties as councillors and as the planning authority was to come up with guidelines for one-off housing as to who would be in a position to get a one-off rural house by virtue of rural need. So given the numbers of the population growth that we were supposed to draw up a set of directives for who would be willing, who would be in a position to gain a house by rural need, particularly those with long-standing demonstrable economic ties to the community, but also particularly those who would have an absolute rural need in terms of being farmers, etc. That could not be satisfied by a dwelling within a town a town or village. Because we have come up with weaker standards, there's a strong risk that I hold, that our rules for rural need will stand, but the objection on not counting one-off houses will fall. Basically, the Office of the Planning Regulator is not going to rewrite each of these rural need rules individually. The consequence of that is that we will end up granting one-off houses in the first year. And then anybody with a proper standing of rural need will cease to be able to get a house after about 2023, 24. I think planning will fall badly. When we're planning at the, okay, so when we got down to the detail of working through the objectives, several hundred of the submissions made were classic rezoning submissions, and we had local area plans for each of the settlements. Well, we have detailed full local area plans for Ballinasloe and Tuam. I think are being done separately and will come in parallel, but those have been done by the local those communities. As a full county, we did the local plans for all of the smaller settlements from Quarter 6, so about 12 towns all told. This is an example of one. This is Mulligan, and you will see approximately what we are told to do. It is our plan basically is our requirement is, having been given in the case of Mulligan, the expectation of the population growing by 450 in the period, which is about 150. We were to zone in sufficient land for that number of houses to be built, which is about 180 houses under the main design. The planning had to be contiguous within the village. We do get to decide on individual which areas we think are likely to be built. We can. It is down to local knowledge from the councillors as to whether or not we think planning applications will actually succeed, be submitted or not in each of these cases. One of the dangers of the plan is that we can plan in principle for 400 houses to be built in Mulligan. If the landowners who own the land decide not to build on that, we are then constrained in not having sufficient land within and sufficient housing built. So a fair judgment call comes in as to which happens. You will notice that there's existing residential areas that are being marked in this plan that were being proposed to be added to the area that is built up. There's residential phase 1, phase 2. Residential phase 2 is a concept that was used in previous plans, which was that when land that's zoned R1 has been consumed, the land marked R2 then becomes possible for zoning. This too is contentious. We were not supposed to zone any land R2, but in Headford, large fractions of the land were zoned R2. So there's a strong desire by a lot of the councillors to zone as much land as possible. We were limited by the population numbers as to exactly how many houses we are supposed to zone and how much land we are supposed to zone for each village. And really only dictated as to where it actually goes. So R2 zoned land is also likely to get struck down by the planner, and we will then see by the OPR, and we will then potentially see ourselves limited in and have a housing crisis in places, because the the councillors decided to build in particular in places that were deemed suitable to them, but don't actually make planning sense. You'll also see that when it comes down to a zoning query by a member of the public, we were approached by landowners, of course, who want their field zoned residential or commercial or whatever, so that they can potentially build on that. When we get to the stage of the plan, if we decide to do so, we were effectively deciding not to zone somewhere else. And if we decide to pick a random field that's not contiguous, we effectively have to extend the village in that direction and make land out to that contiguous. So a large fraction of the desires of landowners that their random field be selected were simply not going to be possibly entertained under the structure involved. Okay. Next, the key thing that the biggest contentious issue that in terms of the public submissions was wind farms. Now, we had a wind strategy previously in the previous county development plan, and in the new plan we have what that has become a local area renewable energy strategy, LARES, because it actually overlaps both wind and solar, and a fair amount of detail going into solar. This diagram here shows the land that is considered strategic, acceptable for in use for potential use for zoning for wind farms. Note that the markdown is deployment zones. Criteria were picked potential that in the plan that for when wind turbines could potentially be built, but land was not zoned for turbines. So this is not a zoning map. It is possible that an area, for example, along the coast that you see there marked in red, would potentially be deemed in this map as a strategic or suitable area for a wind turbine. But if a developer decided to build a 130-meter turbine there, it would impact the local houses by means of flicker, by shadowing, etc., and be deemed unsuitable. So an area may be considered strategic or acceptable in principle for a wind turbine, but in practice that depends on the height of the turbine. So a large fraction of these areas will not be usable in practice. But still, we ended up with a large pushback from the community. There's been a lot of bad experiences along the coastline of housing impacted by turbines. And so a proposal was put in place that there would be a buffer zone of 6 kilometers away from the coast in which no turbines would be considered possible. And that removed most of the contentious areas without actually impacting any significantly on the number of turbines that are likely to appear on the coast. We had a couple of important disagreements with the OPR. One of them would be where in the draft plan we had it had been decided that land had been zoned that was deemed unsuitable by the OPR. There was a case in Uachtarard where a set of land on the east side of the village near the rugby pitches was to be zoned for residential, and that was deemed by the OPR as to be contrary to the rules because it had no access to the N59 and one or two other purposes. These were then contested by the councillors, particularly by Councillor Tom Welby, who pointed out that there was a particular entrance. So it comes down to, does the OPR consider that as sufficient grounds? More problematically, there was land in Oranmore that was zoned that was considered to be in a flood zone. And there was the land that the OPR considered should be zoned as residential that the local community considered to be in a flood zone at Cowan Niche. And so we ran counter to the OPR in our submission on that one, pointing out historical records of that land being flooded and being unsuitable. There's another piece of land in Owenmore that the OPR pushed back against because it was too far out from the village, and that point is also being contested. An example of another one that will be counter to the OPR, but much more comical, I think, would be this one in Woodlawn. We had a developer who was pushing a large housing development in Woodlawn, which is outside Ballinasloe, which is about 200 or 300 meters from the railway station, but has otherwise no facilities. And that was being put forward by the developer as being in alignment with government plans, because there was a railway station 300, 400 meters away. So it was suitable for sustainable transport. In practice, it had no wastewater treatment, no water treatment plants, wastewater treatment. The developer would be willing to put in such a plant, but in practice, we've had a large. The county has been stung badly in the past by developers going bust and ending up inheriting waste treatment facilities such that it was in no position to maintain, and that were unsuitable. So this is a case where the forward planners and the executive strongly disagree with the use of, say, reed bed systems, which, while potentially a good solution for wastewater treatment, are not connected to an Irish water network and have sustainability issues from the county's perspective if we end up inheriting them. There were a number of good changes came through in the county development plan that we agreed with. There's a large town centres first policy being put forward into that, which we went into. That we actively support town centres. There's a large amount of a large focus towards active travel within permeating throughout the plan, and a large push towards permeability as part of the centres, connectivity to blueways, greenways, waterways throughout the plan. Also, that we will develop local area plans, local area mobility plans, and we're successful in getting that included in the work. The cycling and pedestrian infrastructure will follow DEMERS and the NTA Permeability Best Practices Guide. Sustainable transport will include work on permeability and filtered permeability. So there's good scope and possibilities within the plan, but whether or not they come to fruition is a challenge. Wastewater treatment was another example of a key challenge for us in the county. There are a couple of key schemes that are contested by local communities. There's the Randstone sewage, which went through on board Planola, and is now at a detailed design stage, and will probably go through, depending on permission, may go through in 2023. And Cllr is one that's further behind. It's being built on essentially the site that's been proposed by Irish Water for a wastewater treatment plant in Cllr and Sohan is only a few meters into the dunes at the pier there, and it's only about 2 or 3 meters above. It should be open tanks within tens of meters of the water, and only about 2 or 3 meters above the sea level. So a horrific place to be placing a wastewater treatment plant, and that was contested by myself and other councillors. Ballinasloe is contested also by local councillors there, because it was to be a site for a regional wastewater management policy, and that's been heavily contested by Councillor Parsons in particular area due to flooding issues around Ballinasloe Tune area. So in the Cllr, we basically we disagreed with the OPO and wrote in a 100-meter setback that there should be a 100-meter separation between houses and any new wastewater treatment plants, which was the effective rule that applied everywhere else except for Cllr and Spiddle. And we wrote it into the plan this time round, and we'll see how the OPO submits on that. We did manage to get in environmental justice written into the plans, so hopefully that will happen. That will go through. This was proposed by Councillor Parsons, and I supported her heavily on this one. Basically, trying to write socioeconomic justice into the plan. This is primarily targeting the work that was going on in East Galway around Ballinasloe, but it's a useful part of the plan, all told. Galway East wastewater treatment plant. Good question. Will it come about? We'll see. Reed beds potentially, if they're run by the question about that's coming up. Reed bed systems are not necessarily bad in themselves. It comes down to whether or not they are maintainable by Irish Water. We also managed to get rights of way into the plan. This was challenged by the OPO. Basically required us to do so as a recommendation that we write rights of way. But the chief executives had pushed back against that, saying that would be too much of a piece of work, too much work on the county council to draw up a list of the rights of way. But I managed to get that through in the end, which really shouldn't have been a battle, but was. It is now a policy objective of the council to map and establish through public engagement all of the a register of all of the rights of way as resources permit. The language does get watered down over as it goes as you push the submissions through, but they're sometimes the only way of getting them in. So all told, we're coming up now to the end of the material alteration submissions plan. There are some wins, some losses in the plan from an environmental perspective. We got rights of way. I got a tree policy in. Galway County Council will now deploy tree protection orders, in particular around key trees. It had never, in principle, these can be used to protect historic stands of trees, but had never been used before by Galway County Council. But now it's agreed that we will do so. The setback the setback out from the coastline in Barna was moved to 15 meters, where in the draft plan it was to be 30. The community in Barna basically wanted a 50-meter setback from the sea because of flooding. I proposed that and surprisingly got 0 supporters amongst 38 other councillors. Instead, it was moved back to 15 meters, and some building on the coastline within 15 meters of the shore is now zoned. And that's an openly contentious issue that SOS Barna are fighting. We fought the modal shift was being pushed by the OPR. We won't be doing plans to count modal shift because the executive pushed back on that on a resource issue, and I didn't manage to get a vote passed on that one. So we won't be including modal plans on how to draw up either the baseline or how to do modal shift. We will be doing local area plans. And in general, there's minimal planning for sea level rise. One of the few things that we can do as councillors is land use planning, and we are the only. So when it comes to sea level rise, we have a long-term challenge that we know the sea will rise approximately 8 to 15 meters and that much is locked in over the next 100 to 1,000 years. On the worst case, we're probably looking at 2.5 to 3 meters sea level rise by 2100. And it then rising by 3 meters every century. So effectively along the coastline, we need to move our villages inland. Moving villages takes time. Doing it properly, doing it without panic takes decades, a century. Essentially, we need to say the new village centre will be up there, pointing somewhere up the hillside, and moving the only organisation in the state who's in a position to do that is the local council, and the only ones with the legal and moral authority to do so are the county councillors representing the local communities. But that long-term planning is not happening. And so unfortunately, we're not yet preparing for sea level rise. And overall, Brendan basically said, language, the language within the plan is very positive, but it has a habit of coming down to what the executive thinks it means. So a large fraction of submissions by communities and groups were basically dismissed by the executive as saying, we have a policy supporting that in the plan. But whether that actually happens is another matter entirely. It depends on a very large fraction depends on the interpretation of the councillor. So that's a summary of where we are with the county development plan.
Thanks a million.
Okay.
All right, I'm just trying to start my video again.
Yeah.
My dog might start barking as well. That was absolutely fantastic and a really great overview as well on where the county development plan is. Sorry, someone's trying to get in there. Oh, I think someone's let them in. So will we take a few questions? I know we're overrunning a bit and maybe we'll spend about 15 minutes, but I thought the presentations were fantastic from both Alistair and Brendan, and taught us a lot, I think, of what we need to do and the issues are coming. So let's see if we've got anything there, or if anyone wants to ask a question there. You can raise your hand, or just keep your points short.
Niall, do you want to come in? You're the first hand I see up.
Thanks, guys. Two fantastic presentations there. Oh, sorry, I didn't have my camera on. Two fantastic presentations there. And I've spent an awful lot of time with the city development plan, and I still learned a couple of new things this evening. So that's good. But there's, I suppose there's just two. There's not so much questions, but two minor points I'd make about Brendan's presentation on submissions. It's very useful to be very specific. If you can manage to pinpoint an objective and just change the wording of it, that's going to get, because it's so specific, it's much easier for the people who have to look at it and vote on it. It's much easier to focus on. If you do a 10-page submission and it's fantastic, there's a good chance that nobody will actually ever read it, no matter how much we say we have. And the things that they focus on when you do a submission, the things that they tend to eliminate it on is they say, well, the city development plan isn't the right place for that. A good example of that was the national park cities. They were saying, oh yeah, we can sign up to national park cities, but not in the development plan. And that's because the development plan carries more legal weight. So if there was a planning application and somebody said, well, that doesn't fit in with what national park cities say, and there was a general fear that anything that restricts development is something we don't want in our city development plan. So do be careful that zoning and planning issues are what they want. It's not an implementation plan saying the city should do X, Y, and Z or spend money on X, Y, or Z. isn't always something that fits. So sometimes whether your submission gets accepted or not will be based very much on whether you found the right place in the plan for it and proved that it belongs in the city development plan rather than somewhere else, rather than as distinct from whether the thing you want is a good idea or not. I like to think of the city development plan as a vision for what city we want to create, but a lot of people involved in the process see it as very much about zoning and planning regulation as distinct from any kind of vision thing. And another way that things are kicked to touch is a lot of transport stuff. They'll just say, oh, that's part of the GTS. And so you need to be ready to counter that argument in whatever you present. So there were just a couple of things that occurred to me during the presentation. Also, be careful of the timeline of anything you're submitting on. Brendan talked about the housing needs study, and that was all written before Housing for All. So there's an awful lot of stuff in there that's changing. There's documents that are out of date by the time we even get to look at the beginning of the city development plan. And that's a point of frustration. I'm not sure how we fix it, but it's just something to be aware of. So there are my couple of cents worth. Thanks very much. And thanks for the great presentations again.
Thanks very much, Niall. We have a question there on where we are on the ring road, the network. A lot of good work was done by other groups and different. We didn't really take a position on the ring road, and we were fairly newly established on the ring road stuff. Obviously, many of us would be against the ring road, increasing traffic, and I suppose it's like with on board Panola, so or with the judicial reviews coming up, next. So we're all waiting to see what happens with that, I suppose, you know. And it's interesting as well, you know, that it wasn't just Friends of the Irish Environment that took the case. It was also the racecourse, Brooks Corbett. I'm not sure if there was any more. Was there, Brendan?
No, I think there's just those three, but of course, Friends of the Irish Environment got all the attention.
Yeah.
You know.
So it's important, you know, that we hear the language of when you make an environmental complaint, you're a NIMBY. But we didn't hear that language when it's business people or something objecting. So, you know, it's fair is fair, you know, whether you want the road or don't want the road. Sorry, the dog is beside me here. Whether you want the road or don't want the road, you know, we should be respectful of each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's what goes on in a lot of these things, is the respect is lost. So I think very much with our how we do as environmental groups together is we are respectful to each other. You know, we may disagree with people, and some people want development and housing everywhere and all the green space used up, and a lot of us mightn't want that at all. But I think to look at the development plan as well, we need to look at, you know, I think especially in your own areas as well, look to how you want to see your area progress in the future. What you want, what do you need to have a happy life? How's it going to affect climate change in the future, the flooding? Lots of things that Brendan and Alistair brought up there are really important as well. And I think if people could understand it better and understand submissions, it's not about someone building a house beside you, but it's really how that affects your whole area. I think you really have to look at the bigger picture rather than just, you know, my view is gone, you know. Is it the right place for a house? You know, or is it the right place for a building development? Sometimes it is the right place, even though you don't want it there, you know. We just have to be realistic about it as well. And in a city, we're really constrained by the spaces, you know. We're trying to save the green spaces, but we're also trying to progress on brownfield sites and get good planning on those sites and derelict sites. I'll just check to see if there's any more questions there.
Thank you.
Anybody, anything else to say? Brendan, do you want anything? Did you see any questions there that you needed to answer, or Alistair?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, Niall is right. We kept getting the mantra, this is a land use plan, not an implementation plan, when we were pushing it through. So that was kind of the key ones for us. On a personal level, try keeping your submissions short and to the point. They were all read out and read into the minutes, which meant 100 hours of meetings on this purpose. So that was a fair amount of work, a fair amount more work than we anticipated. But it's useful to see that the public participation in that is coming more into the plan. But the role of the planning regulator is key, and we'll see how where they come back next with the changes that were proposed in the material alterations plan. I suspect that we will see the minister intervening on behalf of the OPR, and we've already seen that in Meath. I think that'll happen in Galway.
Yeah. Can I just ask about kind of mining and resources and that kind of stuff in the development plan? Is there anything in that in the county?
I got some wording into the plan that, in principle, blocks mining. There was a large push to make sure that quarrying and traditional extractive was still allowed, but not mining for minerals and base metals, as it was labelled. But the wording is far from desirable. But I was struck. But the forward plan was basically there was a large debate with them as to what would be wording that would potentially stand up from their perspective. But so I didn't get wording as strong as I'd like.
Yeah, because I think that'll be an interesting one to follow over the next few years in our in our rural areas, is mining.
Yeah.
And resource needs. Anybody else? Any questions?
Actually, just on that for Alistair here, I'm just wondering around gas and the proposals for the development of a plant in County Galway in Tyna. I don't know if that came up in these discussions, or I know that decision is coming in the next few months, maybe.
It came up, but not as a significant matter. It's allowed within the plan. The biogas is allowed within the plan. We didn't go into a detailed plan for energy and for biogas in the same way.
Okay.
Is that what you mean?
Is that okay, Jacinta?
Oh, I was thinking of the proposed gas plant, so I didn't think that was biogas. Okay,
no, I'm thinking of something different then. Okay.
Okay.
No, it didn't come up.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any questions before we leave it there? I just say to people as well, when you are putting in submissions and you want your councillors to take them seriously, because a lot of them they love votes. So what you should do as well is, if you have kind of stuff coming up in your communities, make sure that people put in individual submissions, because every individual submission is a vote. And you could make it sure that your community is aware of what's happening in their areas, and maybe get them all to make individual submissions. I think that's very important, that your councillors will recognise the problems in your area as well, if there is stuff. Brendan?
Just one final minor point I'd like to make. The good thing about the electronic version of the documents, they're very long, but the one advantage of the electronic version is you can put in a keyword and search for it. You could search for something to do with your own area, like Ballyban or whatever it is, or your own specific area of interest. So it is very helpful to try and focus in and find the right thing in the documents. That's the one thing I'd like to say. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And we might try and put some kind of a short document together on making a submission, or we'll have a look at that as well. So thank you very much. Unless there's any other questions before we go. Excellent presentations from both Alistair and Brendan. I think everyone will have learned more stuff, or if you didn't know any stuff, you'll have definitely learned stuff. It was fantastic, really, really good. And thank you so much. And we will have this up on YouTube hopefully soon. And we will also maybe get your presentations from you guys, if that's okay. And we'll put them up as files. We'll share those files, because I think there's a lot of really good information in both documents, in both presentations. Thank you all, and thanks Jacinta for having us here on the network's Zoom. And thanks everyone. Good night.
Good luck. Good night.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.